Winter spirits and folklore of the Scottish Highlands. The night is quiet here in the Highlands. Beyond the window, snow lies thick upon the peaks of the mountains, their dark shapes softened beneath winter's blanket. A pale moon rises over the loch, casting silver light across water that has begun to freeze at the edges. Inside, the peat fire burns low in the hearth, glowing embers shifting and settling with soft whispers. Tonight, as the wind rattles the window frame and the cold presses close against the glass, we will journey together through the folklore of winter in the Scottish Highlands. These are not the cheerful tales of fireside comfort alone, but stories born of long darkness, of isolation, and of the spirits that walk when the world grows cold. They are stories that kept people safe, stories that gave shape to fear, and stories that reminded our ancestors they were never truly alone, even in the deepest winter night. Let us begin. We start our journey not on land, but at sea, between the northern Outer Hebrides and the Scottish mainland lies a stretch of water known as the Minch, a strait notorious for its treacherous currents and sudden storms. Sailors who have crossed these waters speak of something stranger than weather alone. They speak of the blue men. In Scottish Gaelic, they are called na Fíor Gorama. This particular stretch of sea near the Shant Isles is known as through Nam Fíor Goram, the stream of the blue men. The waters here are never still. Even on the calmest days, the surface churns and rolls with strange motion, as though something beneath moves restlessly through the depths. The blue men are said to be the size of humans, but with skin the colour of deep water, grey faces, and long, restless arms. Some accounts describe them wearing blue caps. Others say they have beards the colour of sea foam, green and white and ever-shifting. They live in underwater caves near the Shant Isles, dwelling in clans beneath the waves with their own chief to lead them. When the blue men sleep, the weather remains fair and the sea lies calm, but when they wake, they summon storms at will. In the dark months, when days are short and the cold wind howls across the Minch, when storms arise more frequently, the blue men rise from their caves to hunt for ships. They swim with their torsos raised out of the water, diving and twisting like porpoises, but with a deliberate, almost playful menace. When they gather to attack a vessel, their chief rises from the waves and calls out 2 lines of poetry to the ship's captain. This is a test. The captain must respond immediately with his own 2 lines, completing the verse without hesitation. If his answer is clever enough, if his wit is sharp and his tongue quick, the blue men grant safe passage. But if he falters, if he cannot match them rhyme for rhyme, they seize the ship and drag it down to the depths. Folklorist Donald Alexander Mackenzie, writing in 1917, preserved one such exchange. The blue men's chief calls out, "Man of the black cap, what do you say as your proud ship cleaves the brine?" The captain, thinking fast, responds, "My speedy ship takes the shortest way, and I'll follow you line by line." The challenge continues, the chief shouting out couplet after couplet across the churning water, the captain answering each one in turn, until the blue men, satisfied or perhaps simply impressed, allow the ship to pass. This was no mere game. In winter especially, when storms could rise without warning and ice could form on the rigging, the ability to outwit the blue men could mean the difference between life and death. Sailors prepared themselves, practicing their rhyming skills, keeping old verses ready in their minds for the moment when grey faces might appear in the waves. But the blue men were not always hostile. The people of the Outer Hebrides knew how to show respect. On the night of Samhain, candles were lit by the shore and left burning as offerings. Ale was poured into the sea as a gift, in hopes that the blue men would repay the kindness by leaving seaweed washed up on the beach, valuable fertilizer for the thin soil of the islands. Treat them with care, the old ones said, and they might protect you. Anger them, and winter storms would find you, no matter how skilled your seamanship. Imagine a winter crossing of the Minch. The sky is the colour of iron, heavy with the promise of snow. The wind cuts across the water like a blade. Your boat rises and falls on grey waves that seem to have no pattern, no rhythm you can follow. Then you see them, blue shapes in the water, moving toward you with impossible speed, arms reaching, faces rising, and a voice booming across the storm, calling out a riddle in verse. Your heart pounds, your crew looks to you, and you must answer. The blue men are the personification of the sea itself, unpredictable, powerful, beautiful, and deadly. They remind us that the water has moods, as changeable as any living thing, that respect must be paid, that cleverness and preparation might save you when strength cannot. If the blue men belong to the winter sea, then the Nuckelavee belongs to the winter shore. Of all the creatures in Scottish folklore, none is more terrible, none inspires greater horror. The Nuckelavee is nightmare made flesh, or rather, nightmare stripped of flesh entirely. This creature comes from Orkney, the wind-swept islands of Scotland's northern coast, but stories of it spread to the northern Highlands, wherever the sea meets the land. The Nuckelavee is a fusion of horse and rider, but whether they are two beings joined together or one monstrous whole, no one can say. What is certain is this: the Nuckelavee has no skin. Its entire body is raw, exposed muscle. Black blood flows through yellow veins that pulse and throb visibly with every movement. White sinews stretch and contract like ropes pulled taut. The horse's head has a single enormous eye that glows red like a coal. Its mouth is wide as a whale's, and from it comes breath like steam from a boiling kettle, breath that carries disease and death. The human torso that rises from the horse's back has a head that lolls and rolls as though it might fall off at any moment. Its arms are long, long enough to drag on the ground, with hands that end in blackened claws. The smell alone is said to be unbearable. The stench of rotting seaweed, of decay, of sickness itself. The Nuckelavee lives beneath the sea for most of the year, restrained by a deity known as the Mother of the Sea, a benevolent force who keeps the monster imprisoned in the depths during the summer. But when autumn arrives and her power wanes, when winter's cold begins to grip the islands, the Nuckelavee is freed. It rises from the waves and comes ashore, bringing with it all the afflictions of the dark season. Wherever the Nuckelavee walks, crops wither, livestock fall sick with murrain, a wasting disease that spreads through the herds like wildfire. Wells dry up, rivers slow to a trickle. People are struck by fevers and plagues, by illnesses that have no name and no cure. The creature's toxic breath alone can kill. It needs neither tooth nor claw. Its very presence is blight. The Nuckelavee attacks without mercy and without reason. It does not need to be angered or provoked. It simply hates. It hates all living things, and it will chase a person for miles, galloping with terrible speed, shrieking and roaring like a storm-given voice. But it has one weakness. The Nuckelavee cannot cross fresh water. Streams, rivers, even puddles of rainwater act as barriers. Those fleeing the creature know to run for the nearest burn, to leap across running water and find safety on the other side. In winter, when rivers freeze and streams ice over, this becomes more difficult. The terror deepens. One of the most famous stories comes from Orkney, recorded in the 19th century by folklorist Walter Trail Denison. A man named Thomas was walking home late one night. The moon was out, bright and cold, casting long shadows across the road. His path ran between the sea on one side and a freshwater loch on the other. As he walked, he saw something ahead of him in the moonlight. At first he thought it was a man on horseback, but as it drew closer, he realised it was far too large, far too wrong. It was the Nuckelavee. Thomas stood frozen. The creature approached slowly, deliberately, its single red eye fixed upon him. He could see the muscles moving beneath the absence of skin, could see the black blood pumping, could smell the death reek rolling off it in waves. He wanted to run, but he knew that to turn his back would be fatal. He wanted to scream, but his throat was too tight with fear. Instead, he began to back away, step by careful step, toward the loch. The Nuckelavee followed, matching his pace, its long arms swinging, its head lolling. When Thomas reached the water's edge, he saw a small stream flowing into the loch just ahead. He waited until the creature lunged, then threw himself across the stream. The Nuckelavee shrieked. It reared back, unable to cross. Thomas scrambled to safety on the far side and turned to see the monster standing at the water's edge, howling with rage, its arms reaching but unable to touch him. He had lost his bonnet to those terrible claws, but he had kept his life. The Nuckelavee was more than a monster. It was a symbol of all the disasters that winter could bring to coastal communities: crop failure, disease among the animals, sickness in the home, the dread that comes with knowing you might not survive until spring. When people spoke of the Nuckelavee, they were speaking of real fears, of the helplessness they felt in the face of forces beyond their control. And so they held to the old protections. Never speak its name aloud, lest you summon it. Keep water nearby, fresh and clean. Pray to the mother of the sea to hold the monster down. And in winter, when the wind howls and the smell of the sea turns foul, stay inside, lock the door, keep the fire burning, and wait for dawn. From the shore we turn inland to the rivers and streams that cut through the glens. Here in lonely places, where water runs cold over stone, you might encounter the Bean-Nighe, the Washerwoman at the ford. Of all the spirits of winter, she is perhaps the most sorrowful. She is also called the Little Washer, or the Washer of the Sorrows. She is a type of banshee, a messenger from the other world, and her appearance foretells death. The Bean-Nighe is small, hardly taller than a child. Her face is twisted and ancient, with a hooked nose and a single large nostril. She has one protruding tooth, like a tusk. Her feet are webbed, suited to the water where she spends her endless nights. Most striking of all, she has long, pendulous breasts that hang so low they interfere with her washing. In some stories, she throws them over her shoulders to keep them out of the way. She is dressed in green, the colour of the other world, of the fairy folk, of things that do not belong entirely to our world. And she is always, always washing, slapping wet cloth against stone, scrubbing and rinsing in the icy water, humming or keening a mournful tune that carries on the wind. What she washes are grave clothes, the blood-stained shrouds of those who are about to die. If you see the Bean-Nighe before she sees you, you have a chance. Approach her carefully from behind. Take hold of one of her breasts and put it in your mouth, claiming to be her foster child. If you do this, she is bound by the old laws of kinship. She must answer 3 questions truthfully. You can ask whose shroud she washes. You can ask when death will come. You can ask how it might be prevented. But if she sees you first, the outcome is different. In some regions, it is said she will strike you with the wet shroud and your legs will be paralysed. In others, simply seeing her means your own death is near and there is nothing to be done. The Bean-Nighe is not inherently evil. She does not cause death. She only announces it, prepares for it, mourns it. According to tradition, she herself was once a living woman who died in childbirth, her life cut short before she could finish washing her own baby's clothes. Now she is cursed to wash the grave clothes of others until the day she would have naturally died comes around at last. She is a spirit of sorrow, of interrupted life, of tasks left unfinished. One tale from the Outer Hebrides tells of a man called Gilly Casfluch, whose title meant wet-foot man, for his duty was to carry his chief across streams. One night he was travelling home late when he came to a ford. There in the water, bent over her washing, was a small figure. He knew at once what she was. Quietly, he crept up behind her and grasped her breast, claiming fosterage. She gave him one long, sad look, and then told him whose shroud she washed. It belonged to someone he loved. He thanked her and hurried home to warn them. And because of the warning, the death was avoided, at least for a time. Another story, this one from near Loch Lynn, tells of a maiden walking by the water on a Sunday morning. She turned a corner and saw a small woman standing in the loch, beating clothes against a stone with a club. On the bleaching green nearby lay more than 30 shirts and smocks, all soaked with blood. The maiden continued on her way, troubled but silent. Soon after, the roof of Fern Abbey collapsed during worship, and 36 people were killed. The Bean-Nighe had been washing their shrouds. In winter, the image of the Bean-Nighe takes on even greater poignancy. Picture a stream at twilight, ice forming at the edges, steam rising from water, still warmer than the frozen air. The sky is heavy with the promise of snow. The world is silent, save for the sound of cloth slapping stone, again and again, and a small figure, bent and weeping, washing and washing, knowing the sorrow that is to come, but unable to prevent it. The Bean-Nighe reminds us that death is part of life, that winter claims its due, and that grief is a weight carried by women especially, those who wash the bodies of the dead, who prepare them for burial, who are left behind to mourn. Now we return to the shore, but this time to the beaches, where seals gather on the rocks. The Selkie folk are shapeshifters, creatures who wear the form of seals in the water, but can shed their skins to become human on land. Selkies are said to come ashore on certain special nights to dance beneath the moon. A storm might drive them inland, or a fisherman might find a Selkie skin washed up on the beach, and the Selkie, unable to return to the sea, must walk the land in human form until the skin is found again. There's a famous story from the Hebrides about a fisherman and his children. They were poor, living in a small cottage by the shore. One winter night, the fisherman found a beautiful sealskin washed up on the beach. He took it home and hid it away. The next morning, a young woman appeared at his door. She was shivering, exhausted, with no memory of where she had come from. He invited her inside to warm herself by the fire. She stayed. Days turned to weeks. She cooked, cleaned, cared for his children as though they were her own. The fisherman fell in love with her, and eventually he asked her to marry him. She agreed, though sometimes she would stand at the window, staring out at the sea, with a look of such longing that broke his heart. Years passed. She bore him children of her own, beautiful children with dark eyes and webbed fingers. And still she would stand at the window, listening to the seals sing. Then one day, the children found something hidden in the back of a cupboard, a sealskin, soft and silver grey, folded carefully away. They brought it to their mother. She held it in her hands and she wept. That night, when the fisherman came home, she kissed her children goodbye. She told them they would always hear her singing from the water. Then she took the skin and walked down to the shore. She slipped into the waves and was gone. The Selkie wife loved her children. She loved the man she had married, but the call of the sea was too strong. There's something about this story that feels especially resonant. The longing for something beyond reach, the sense of being trapped, even in a place of love and warmth. The knowledge that some part of you will never be fully at home. Selkie stories remind us that even those we love may carry grief we cannot heal, may long for a world we cannot enter. They remind us that the sea is both beautiful and utterly indifferent to human need. And they remind us that transformation, freedom, and loss are often bound together, inseparable as water and ice. Beneath the snow-covered hills, within the ancient burial mounds and green knolls, dwell the fairy folk, the Sidhe. In winter, their relationship with the human world grows more complex. The Picts, the ancient people who lived in Scotland before the coming of the Gaels, left behind standing stones and mysterious carvings, but they left no written language that has been fully deciphered. Over time, as memory faded and folk imagination took hold, stories began to transform them into something other than human. They became the Pechta in folklore, the little people, eventually blurring into tales of the fairy folk themselves. Stories describe the Pechta as small, strong, and skilled in building and craftsmanship. They brewed ale from heather using secret recipes. They lived underground in chambers, and they sometimes appeared to humans, especially in the cold months when the veil between worlds grew thin. A common motif in Highland fairy folklore tells of a knock at the cottage door on a winter night. The snow is falling thick outside, and the wind howls. The family inside looks at one another nervously. Who would be travelling on such a night? the door opens, and there stands a small figure, perhaps an old woman, perhaps a child, wrapped in tattered clothing and shivering with cold. She asks to come in and warm herself by the fire. This is the test. If she is welcomed, if she is given food and drink and a place by the hearth, she will bless the household before she leaves. The family will find their stores of grain lasting longer than expected, their butter churning more easily, their luck holding through the winter. But if she is turned away, if the door is shut in her face, then misfortune follows. Milk sours, bread fails to rise, illness strikes the children. The fairy folk do not forget unkindness. In some regions, like Perthshire and Aberdeenshire, folk tales speak of small women appearing at spinning wheels during the long winter nights. They are skilled spinners, faster than any human, and they will work through the night if allowed. But they must be treated with respect. Leave out a bowl of milk or a piece of bread. Do not watch them too closely, and never, ever try to cheat them or mock them, for their revenge is swift and their anger long-lasting. The Hebridean Sidhe have their own winter customs. Midwinter is said to be a time when the fairy mounds open, when the barriers between the worlds grow thin. If you walk past a green hill on the longest night and hear music drifting out, do not follow it inside, no matter how beautiful the tune. Time moves differently in the land of the Sidhe. A single night of dancing might mean 100 years have passed in the human world. Protective measures were essential. Rowan wood, with its bright red berries, was carried as a charm against fairy mischief. Iron, which the Sidhe cannot bear to touch, was kept close at hand. Bread and milk were left out as offerings, small gifts to maintain good relations, and children were warned never to eat food offered by strangers in winter, for it might be fairy food, and once you eat it, you can never return home. The Pechta and the Sidhe represent the old beliefs that never quite left the Highlands, the sense that the land itself is alive, inhabited by beings older than memory. Winter, when survival depended on careful management of resources and on the kindness of neighbours, was a time when these beliefs took on practical significance. The stories taught generosity, respect, and caution, and they kept alive the idea that the world is larger and stranger than what we can see by daylight. There are darker tales too, of those who offended the little people and paid terrible prices. A farmer who ploughed over a fairy ring found his cattle dying one by one. A woman who mocked a Pecht woman at her spinning wheel woke to find her hands twisted and useless. A man who refused shelter to a small traveller on a winter night watched his house burn to the ground while the snow fell and the flames reached up to touch the stars. But there are also tales of great kindness repaid. A crofter's wife, who shared her last loaf with a bedraggled old woman, found her larder full the next day. A boy who protected a fairy mound from vandals was led to a hidden spring that never froze, even in the deepest winter. A family who always left out offerings on the winter solstice found that their children never fell ill, that their harvest never failed, that fortune smiled on them year after year. The little people, the Pechta, the she, they are not gone. Even now, in the modern world, there are those who leave offerings, who speak respectfully of the good neighbours, who know better than to disturb the old places. For winter in the Highlands is long, and the darkness is deep, and it pays to have friends in high places and low. Winter in the Highlands was governed by countless superstitions, small rules and signs that helped people navigate the dark months. These were not idle beliefs, but ways of reading the world, of finding order in chaos, of maintaining some sense of control when so much was beyond human power. Animal omens were closely watched. Ravens and crows, those blackbirds that gather around death, were treated with wary respect. To see a raven flying alone at dawn meant change was coming. To hear one call before setting out on a journey meant turning back was wise. Ravens were often left offerings in winter, for they were seen as messengers between worlds. White hares, rare and ghostly against the snow, were signs of transformation and witchcraft. Some said they were witches in animal form. Others said seeing one meant good fortune, but only if you did not try to harm it. To kill a white hare in winter was to invite disaster. Stags seen at dawn, silhouetted against the rising sun, were symbols of sovereignty and the old gods. They carried with them a sense of ancient power, of the wild places that humans could never fully tame. To see a stag in winter, especially a great antlered male, was to be reminded that you were in a land ruled by forces older than Christianity, older than memory. Cattle behaviour predicted storms. If the cows refused to leave the byre in the morning, a blizzard was coming. If they huddled together in the far corner of the field, snow would fall by nightfall. Farmers learned to trust these signs more than their own eyes, for the animals knew things humans did not. Dogs howling at night meant death was near. Not the death of the dog itself, but of someone in the household or village. If a dog howled 3 times and then felt silent, the death would come within 3 days. This was not superstition alone. Dogs can hear and smell things beyond human perception. Perhaps they truly did sense the approach of illness or misfortune. Weather prophecy was essential for survival. The moon was watched carefully. A ring or halo around the moon meant snow or rain was coming. If the ring was large, the storm would be distant. If it was tight around the moon's face, the storm would arrive soon. The colour of the moon mattered too. A red moon meant wind, a pale moon meant frost. Cloud formations were read like text, long, thin clouds stretching across the sky meant wind. Clouds piled high like mountains meant heavy snow. A clear sky at sunset, with the sun sinking into a bank of dark clouds, meant the next day would be harsh. The behaviour of fire and smoke told stories as well. If the smoke from the hearth fire blew back down the chimney instead of rising, bad weather was on its way. If the fire refused to catch, if the peat smouldered but would not flame, something was wrong. Spirits were near, or illness was coming, or misfortune was gathering just outside the door. Death omens were especially powerful in winter. A knock at the door when no one was there, a bird hitting the window, a clock stopping without reason, mirrors cracking. These were all signs that death had been marked, that someone in the household was soon to pass. And in winter, when the thin and the old were most vulnerable, these signs were taken very seriously. There were also everyday taboos, small rules that governed behaviour. Never whistle at night, for whistling calls the wind, and in winter the wind can kill. Never spill salt without throwing a pinch over your left shoulder to blind the devil. Never place shoes on the table, for that invites death. Never open all the windows at once in winter, except at midnight on New Year's Eve, when the old year must be swept out and the new year welcomed in. And always, always be mindful of thresholds, the space between inside and outside, between safety and danger, between this world and the other world. Doorways were protected with rowan crosses. Salt was scattered across thresholds, and on certain nights no one crossed the threshold after dark, for fear of what might follow them inside. These superstitions were not just beliefs. They were a language for talking about risk, about the unknown, about the ever-present possibility of disaster. They gave people a sense of agency, a feeling that if they followed the rules, if they paid attention to the signs, they might survive. And in the Scottish Highlands, in winter, survival was never guaranteed. The heart of the Highland home in winter was the hearth. The fire was more than warmth. It was life itself, a sacred flame that connected the household to the sun, to the old gods, to the long chain of ancestors who had tended fires before them. To let the fire go out completely in winter was considered a terrible calamity. It meant the household had lost its protection, its connection to the sacred, and so the fire was carefully tended, never allowed to die. At night it was smeared, banked with ashes and peat, so that it would burn slowly through the dark hours, ready to be coaxed back to flame in the morning. The smearing of the fire was accompanied by a prayer, often in Gaelic, calling on Bridget or the saints of the old powers to watch over the household while it slept. I smoor this fire as the Son of Mary would smoor. Blessed be the house, blessed be the fire, blessed be the people all. The ashes from the hearth had their own power. They were scattered on the fields in spring to carry the blessing of the home fire into the soil. They were mixed with water to make a paste for healing wounds. They were used in divination, patterns traced in the ashes to read the future or to seek answers to questions. The threshold of the home was the most vulnerable point, the place where danger could enter. Protections were layered thick. Rowan crosses, made from 2 small branches, tied together with red thread, were hung above the door. The rowan tree was sacred, its berries bright as blood, and it held power against witchcraft and evil spirits. Iron horseshoes, their points facing upward to hold in the luck, were nailed to the doorframe. Iron was anathema to the fairy folk, to spirits and shapeshifters. It anchored the home to the physical world, kept the other world at bay. Salt was scattered across the threshold in a thin line. Salt preserved food, prevented decay, and was considered purifying. It created a barrier that malevolent forces could not cross. Blessed water, drawn from a holy well, or from a dead and living ford, a place where both the living and the dead crossed regularly, was sprinkled around the door and windows. This water had been forspoken, blessed with prayers or charms, and it carried protective power. Some homes had secret symbols carved into the door frame or chalked onto the walls, marks that only the family knew. These sigils, called on older powers, pre-Christian protections that had been passed down through generations in whispers. The practice of seining, of ritually purifying and protecting the home, was especially important in winter. Seining involved both water and smoke. On New Year's morning, after the drinking of blessed water from the dead and living ford, every room in the house was sprinkled. The beds, the floors, the inhabitants themselves. Then the house was sealed tight, every door and window closed, and juniper branches were set alight. Juniper smoke is thick, pungent, and it filled the house until people coughed and sputtered. This was intentional. The smoke drove out any negative spirits or influences that had gathered over the old year. It purified the space, made it clean and safe for the year to come. When the smoke had done its work, all the doors and windows were flung open to let in the cold, fresh air of the new year. The inhabitants took a restorative dram of whisky, and the household began the year clean and protected. Other protective plants were equally important. Holly and ivy were brought inside at midwinter, but only in the proper way. Holly represented the masculine, protective energy. Ivy represented the feminine, binding energy. Together they kept the balance, but they had to be invited in, not simply taken. and they had to be removed before spring, or they would bring bad luck. Birch twigs were hung above beds to protect sleepers from nightmares and from visitations by spirits. Dried herbs, rosemary for memory and protection, thyme for courage, sage for wisdom, hung from the rafters in the kitchen, lending their scent and their power to the food cooked below. One plant was never brought inside, hawthorn. The hawthorn tree belonged to the fairy folk. To bring its branches into the house, especially in winter, was to invite their attention in dangerous ways. Hawthorn was respected but kept at a distance. Food and offerings were part of the protective customs as well. Milk and bread were left out at night, small gifts to placate the spirits or to share with travellers who might be something other than human. The last sheaf of grain from the harvest was kept in the house through winter, a reminder of the growing season and a promise that spring would return. Bannocks, flat oatcakes, were baked with prayers worked into the dough, and the first piece was always given to the animals before humans ate. Evening and bedtime brought their own rituals. Prayers were spoken in Gaelic, old prayers that blended Christian saints with older names, calling in protection from all quarters. May Michael the Valiant be watching over us. May Bridget the Gentle be guarding our sleep. May the King of the Elements keep harm from our door. West-facing windows were kept closed and shuttered after dark. The west was the direction of the dead, the direction of the other world. The slua, the host of the unforgiven dead, flew from the west on winter nights, searching for souls to carry away. An open window was an invitation they would not refuse. All iron tools were brought inside at night: axes, knives, ploughshares. Partly this was practical, to prevent theft or rust, but it was also protection. Iron belonged inside, close at hand, ready to defend against anything that might come creeping in the dark. The direction you lay in bed mattered. Sleeping with your head to the north was considered unlucky, aligning you with the direction of cold and death. Better to sleep with your head to the east, the direction of the rising sun. Children were taught specific prayers to say if they woke frightened in the night. Simple words, calling on Bridget or Christ, or the light of the fire to keep them safe. And they were told never to look out the window after dark, never to answer a voice that called their name, never to follow lights that moved across the moor. Community protections were equally vital. On certain nights, particularly Samhain and the winter solstice, households would join together to watch. They would keep vigil, singing songs, telling stories, keeping the darkness at bay with human voices and human presence. This was not just superstition, it was survival. A community that looked after one another, that stayed together through the darkest nights, was a community that would survive the winter. The role of the eldest woman in the household was particularly important. She was the keeper of the hearth, the one who knew the old prayers and the old protections. She taught the younger women how to smear the fire, how to make the protective charms, how to read the signs. Her knowledge was the unbroken thread that connected the present to the past. That kept the household safe. But what happened when the protections failed? When the fire went out completely? When something crossed the threshold uninvited? When the slua were heard passing overhead? Then there were emergency measures, prayers spoken quickly, iron brandished, salt thrown, rowan held up like a shield. And if all else failed, if the danger was too great, you ran to your neighbours, you hammered on their door and called for help, because in winter no one survives alone. The fire in our hearth has burned low. The embers glow red and gold, shifting softly as they settle into ash. Outside the wind has died down. The snow falls silently, steadily, blanketing the world in white. We have journeyed tonight through the folklore of winter in the Scottish Highlands. We have met the blue men in their churning seas, clever and dangerous. We have seen the Nuckelavee in all its horror, a reminder of the disasters that winter could bring. We have stood by the ford and watched the Bean-Nighe at her sorrowful work. We have heard the songs of the Selkies and felt their longing. We have opened the door to the Pechta and learned the cost of inhospitality. We have learned to read the signs and omens that govern survival. And we have seen how our ancestors protected their homes and their families through ritual and reverence. These stories are not just entertainment. They are maps of fear and hope, guides to navigating a world that was often harsh and unpredictable. They taught practical wisdom, dressed in the language of the supernatural. They reminded people that the world was full of forces beyond their control, but also that there were ways to live in harmony with those forces, ways to show respect, ways to protect what mattered the most. Winter in the Highlands was long and dark and dangerous, but it was also a time of community, of storytelling, of tending the sacred fire and keeping watch together through the night. The spirits we have spoken of tonight, the blue men and the Nuckelavee, the Bean-Nighe and the Selkies, the fairy folks and all the rest, they were companions of a sort, not friends, perhaps, but familiar presences. They gave shape to the darkness. They made it possible to speak about fear without being consumed by it. And they reminded us still that the world is larger and stranger than we imagine, that the winter sea holds mysteries we will never fully understand, that death is always near, always watching, that transformation and freedom come at a price, That kindness to strangers matters, that respect for the old ways, for the land and the water and the creatures that inhabit them, is not superstition, but wisdom. So as you lie down to sleep tonight, as the snow falls outside your window and the darkness gathers close, remember the old stories. Remember to tend your own hearth, whatever form it takes. Remember to be kind to strangers. Remember to pay attention to the signs. Remember that we are all, in our way, crossing a winter sea, and that cleverness and kindness and a little bit of luck can see us safely through. Rest well by the fire. Let the old spirits watch over you, not with menace, but with the ancient, patient regard of beings who have seen countless winters come and go. They know, as we must learn, that winter always ends, that spring always returns, that the darkness, however deep, is never quite complete as long as the fire still burns. Sleep now, and if you enjoyed this journey, if these old stories brought you comfort or wonder, consider sharing them. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let the tales of the Scottish Highlands accompany you through your own long winter nights. Good night from the fireside. Good night from the Highlands. Good night.